All right. Essentially, I'll talk about oil production in Trinidad and the big picture where we. So I am going to talk to you on 3 different topics this morning. And the first of them will describe where we are at the present time. The second topic I will talk to you about is what technologies there are outside there that people have been trying, and the relative degrees of success. And of course, the third topic I will talk to you about is a topic nearest and dearest to my heart, which is the use of CO2. In between my second topic and my third, Dr. Boudlal would tell you about the availability of CO2 in Trinidad, of which I'm confident he will convince you that there is absolutely no shortage thereof. Right. So the first slide shows you a picture of oil production in Trinidad. And essentially, you will see that in 1978, we had peak oil at about 230,000 barrels. And you will see what amounts to an exceedingly rapid decline I have figures to the year 2015 on this, right? And that decline is, what I will call a crisis decline. Now, Dr. Prasad showed you a quote from Shakespeare in which he essentially translated in English the Chinese calligraphy for crisis, which is very similar to the calligraphy for opportunity. So he's saying exactly the same thing I'm saying. We're in crisis. We have had good news. I saw it in the papers this morning that one company's production rose by 3,000 barrels a day in the last couple of months, right? But you will see here is the latest ministry figures for production in February, 75,500 barrels of oil, of which land produced 22,000, right? Total marine, 53,500, of which Trinmar produced 19,000, and other marine was 34,000. Now, 16,000 of that other marine was condensate. So, in fact, actual black oil production was of the order of 60,000 barrels a day. Now, if you go back to that decline that I showed in the previous curve, and even look back 2 years, just 2 years, you'd see that in the last 2 years, we've lost 6,000 barrels a day on the average over 2 years, right? So that means that per annum, assuming the same decline rates, and we continue business as usual, BAU, in 5 years' time, we're going to lose 15,000. In fact, I hazard a prediction that it'll be far worse than that. So if you think we're in a crisis today, and we are, what will be our condition 4 or 5 years out, right? We will have nothing to leave to our children, and we will have nothing to offer all the young people who are sitting in this room looking for opportunities, not only in the business, but in the country. So we need to do something, and something urgent, right? Our fields are all mature. Land fields in particular are all mature. Dates of discovery, 1908, 1918, right? So that we have to look for technologies which address the mature fields. I'll tell you this, that my presentations will not discuss marine fields on the East Coast, marine oil fields on the East Coast, right? I will be talking about land and the Gulf of Paria specifically, because that is where our immediate EOR or IOR opportunities will lie. And if I use EOR and IOR interchangeably, I'm an old man, and I do not want to get into the semantics of the difference between those two. So please forgive me. As far as I'm concerned, they mean the same thing. Okay? Now, this is a slide from a presentation we did back in several years ago. And it is still true today because the numbers have not significantly changed. On land, we have produced to date about 1.5 billion barrels of oil, and I'll show you a little bit of a breakdown of that, right? Gulf of Paria, about 1 billion, and I'm not too worried about East Coast, but so total production of oil from Trinidad and Tobago, well, Trinidad, right, is about 3 billion barrels of oil to date. And so I'm looking at the western area fields here. Okay, western area fields, and you will see that Point Fortin, Palo Seco Area Forest Reserve, Brighton, Parilands, Guapo, Faizabad, San Francisco, Cura Quarry, Mon Diablo, Queenam, Icacas, Bonas, Orapuch, right? And our production from those areas amounts to about 1.2 billion barrels, okay? Our average recovery is about 18%. Some places are higher, some places are lower. And in many of these fields, IOR or efforts to improve recovery, either secondary or tertiary, using tertiary means, have been tried. So for instance, in Point Fortin, there was water flooding. In Palo Seco area, gas injection, water flooding and steam, right? Forest Reserve, gas injection, water flood, steam, carbon dioxide, et cetera, et cetera. Faizabad, they had gas injection, water flood, a pilot polymer flood scheme even many years ago, steam injection, and so on, right? Bonas and Orapuch had, in Bonas we had a pilot CO2. There is a pilot CO2 there, and in Orapuch there was a project there as well, right? So we have tried some stuff. Some of these things have worked very, very well. Gas injection worked brilliantly, right? When we had gas in abundance to essentially throw away, right? Steam has been, as in the rest of the world, and I'll show that later, extraordinarily successful for Trinidad, right? Production by fields in the eastern area, Guayaguari, which includes Beach, Navet, and Gudron, right? Pinal, Barakpo, Balata, Alias, Catskill, Rock Dome, east and west. This is Maruga fields, basically, right? And you'll see production totaling 2.8 million barrels, right? Pardon me? 2.8? Sorry, okay. Sorry. A little dyslexia crept in there. Overall recovery is of about 21%. What this means is that in both areas of land, we have close to 80% of the oil in place still, right, of the original oil in place. So, which represents, therefore, if we have produced, say, 2.5 billion barrels from land, we're talking about a considerable amount of oil still in the ground available for improved oil recovery. I look at the Gulf of Paria fields, Soldado Main, Soldado East, West, Southwest, North Soldado, and I've included as marine fields here the Brighton Marine and the Point Ligur, right? And we have a total of about 1 billion barrels produced here. And again, our overall recovery is about 18%. These figures are a little better than order of magnitude correct, because essentially they're not all from reports of the same date. All right? So some of them reports go back as far as 1995, some are as late as 2010. All right? So but they're not far off. Okay? So again, in the Gulf of Paria, we are looking at couple of billions of barrels of oil still in place. The main reservoir intervals in the western areas, the Mont Lafon, the Forest, and the Cruise, and I break these out here by the various fields that they have produced from. Okay? And similarly, for the Eastern District, the Gromon, the Herrera, and the Wilson Sands, the Karamat, the Cipero, right, were our main reservoir intervals in those areas. So I want to tell you, of significance is that most of our oils are, I will say, not asphaltenic. And that is of great significance to EOR. Asphaltenic oils tend to be oil wet the reservoir, first of all. And when we talk about CO2, CO2 deposits asphaltenes in the reservoir if the oils are asphaltenic, right? So that we will have to screen reservoirs for that if and when we have them. We have the capability to do so. Dr. Persad, through his private consultancy, has developed an extensive database of the geochemistry of Trinidad oils. So that is one resource to find out whether or not we're in that kind of regime. Another resource will, of course, be the various labs that we have, various labs at the various universities and technical service company labs that can do those tests for you very quickly. Or, in fact, you can do them in your own backyard or office. They're not that complicated to do. So there's good news from the nature of the oils. As we expect, the oil API gravities will increase with depth. And in general, the deeper reservoirs, in the deeper reservoirs, the API gravities range from the upper 80s to the mid-20s, general. That's just a sweeping statement, and that has implications for the types of EOR that you might want to implement. And in the shallower reservoirs, the oils range from the mid-20s to down to about 15 degrees API, or even slightly lower in some cases. I want to talk about the reservoir types, land and Gulf of Paria. Generally, the reservoirs are sand with varying extents of shaliness, and the sands are interbedded with thin layers of shale. That interbedding has implications for the type of EOR techniques that you might try. So for instance, there are technologies which require good vertical permeability. If you have interbedded shales, you may have what amounts to a significant net sand thickness, but not much vertical interconnectivity, which will preclude the use of certain technologies. The sands, most sands frequently shale out within relatively short distances, in terms of international style reservoirs that extend for thousands of meters or feet, or in some cases miles, within relatively short distances. And the consequence of that is there's some uncertainty in terms of interwell connectivities. Shale is generally, the shaliness in the sands is generally of the smectite family, with with illite occurring in some cases, right? Very little kaolinite, if any at all, right? There are implications in terms of the technologies that can be applied if one is dealing with smectite type clays in reservoirs, as well as and/or illite, as the case might be. Porosities generally range in the 18 to 25%. So we have generally good porosities. There is good, and we would expect that because we have fairly large quantities of oil there in a relatively small acreage. Permeability is usually in the range of around 250 to 250 millidarcies to 1.2 darcies, some cases higher, in a few cases lower, but that is a generally good range. So that means that you will tend to have good injectivities as well as good productivities. Flow will occur in either direction. Of interest is that in terms of flood designs or IOR project designs, generally the formations dip with dips trending much higher, angle of dip trending much higher in the vicinity of major faults, right? So those of us who have been to Dr. Prasad's geology class would understand why that is so. And another feature is that major faults intersect the fields, and these, together with multiple cross faults, result in few fault blocks which have a significant number of wells. So you are not dealing, ladies and gentlemen, with sweeping types of floods where you can sit in front of a map on a computer, as we are likely to do these days, and put spots on a map in a pattern for injection and production. That, when you do that, you get failed IOR projects in Trinidad. So the implications for IOR, fluids injected need to be compatible with the shales in the formation and with the reservoir fluids. Interwell connectivity and reservoir continuity need to be established and to be tested continually by diligently monitoring injection and production performance, and adjustments must be made as needed on a timely basis for effective IOR performance. This is grunt work. This is hard work. And if you're not prepared to do that, your IOR projects are doomed to fail from the start. This is not sexy stuff. You know, you gotta be out there taking your measurements, testing your wells, and interpreting the results in the office, right? And you have to do both. And more than likely, the same person has to do both, because things get lost in the translation from field to office. And if you don't see these things with your own two eyes, do not believe it. Again, because we have small fault blocks, single well methods are favored. For example, push-pull for testing connectivity, and there is a side benefit to single well methods in that you tend to get fast returns on your money, right, in terms of production. Injector offtake connectivities, configurations, I just mentioned that a little while ago, may not readily resemble traditional flood patterns for effective flooding. In other words, when you meet a fault block, you have to deal with that fault block on its own terms, right? A fault block with a number of wells, you've got to treat with that on its own terms, right? So that you may have an injector sitting right close to another injector, right? But they're treating two different sets of wells, right? And it doesn't fall into any traditional 5-spot or inverted 5-spot, 7-spot, 9-spot, what have you, pattern, right? Initial flood designs using simulation tools are useful, but need to be updated frequently based on actual reservoir performance data in order to ensure that injector performance is optimized. I was writing my own simulators back in 1975, so I have a love for simulation. But far too often, what we have trained at some of our universities is a set of Atari jockeys, people who know how to sit in front of a computer, use a mouse, and do a design, right? Without any thinking of what the reality is. Many of them have never even seen the well or wells or the area that they're dealing with. They don't know that they're putting a flood on top of a dump or in the middle of a housing area, right? So we need to be careful about these things, and we need to see. As I say, IOR is hard work, but it has excellent, you can get excellent results from it. At this point, I'll stop on that presentation and take any questions. All right, okay. In that case, let me close this one and open IOR Methods. Kippy, Donnie, give me a glass of water, please. Okay. Here we'll talk a little bit about IOR methods. And this is something that I teach a semester-long course on, or have taught semester-long courses on. So to think that I will cover this in 20 minutes and do justice to it is being exceedingly optimistic, right? Necessarily, this will be a cursory view, but there are some points I want to make coming out of this talk. So you can't see this as well as I had hoped you will, but we're talking here about chemical methods, thermal methods, and essentially methods using gas, which could be miscible or immiscible. So right down at the bottom, which is recovery methods, right? Secondary or tertiary recovery, we're talking about chemical, thermal, or gas methods. And just above that is secondary recovery, which uses either water flooding or pressure maintenance, which is essentially injection of natural gas into the formation. Dr. Prasad has stolen this slide for use in his previous presentation. So if it looks familiar, we share an interest in the same things. And essentially, again, what you're seeing is water flooding, terms of cost, total recovery, thermal, polymer, CO2 injection, and surfactant use. Excuse me. And you'll see that these things can increase production recoveries by 30 to 50% above primary, depending on the technology that you use. This cost curve needs to be updated, but you'll see, among other things, that surfactant, which is one of the chemical methodologies, tends to be very pricey, right? CO2 injection is shown here as being very pricey in some cases, low to high price, right? And the reason for that is that in some places, in the US, in Canada, they have to drill for CO2. In some cases, clean it up, then transmitted hundreds of miles, sometimes across the border to a different country, hundreds of miles, right, through pipeline in order to conduct a project. Necessarily you will understand that the capital costs associated with that type of operation are high, initial capital costs, and even some of the operating costs as well. So that world prices for CO2 will be far different from our case, where Dr. Budlal will tell you we have a significant amount of CO2 sitting down the road, right? And just across the street, basically, very short distances, relatively short distances of the order of 1/10 of the distances that we are talking about internationally, right? So that our costs for CO2 are going to be significantly lower, and therefore our CO2 projects are going to cost us far less per barrel in terms of things. EOR is big business worldwide, right? Total EOR worldwide is about 2.5 million barrels a day, right? And these are some old figures. These are back in, this was Larry Lake in 2010, right? So that has increased since then. The Chinese are aggressively increasing improved oil recovery. Venezuela, despite its difficulties, is increasing their own. The USA is increasing as well. Okay? Indonesia is increasing. Everybody is on the increase except Trinidad and Tobago. Right? We are out of the loop, and I'll show you that we should not have been. Thermal methods. In thermal methods, we use heat to produce heat in the formation, and what it does is it reduces the viscosity of the crude, vaporizes some of the oil, right? And it improves the mobility ratio for those of you who understand that term, and we'll talk more about that at a different time. So essentially, two major methods of using heat are cyclic steam injection and steam flooding. Some other technologies which have been used would be the steam injection has been used commercially since the 60s, and that is true of Trinidad and Tobago, Trinidad as well, commercially since the 1960s. It is a very mature technology, and it has been extraordinarily successful everywhere that it has been tried, because of course, you know, you screen reservoirs and you do the appropriate things, right? And you know, you can't run a successful steam flood by being lazy, right? A steam project. Projects have been concentrated mostly in Canada, the former Soviet Union, US, Venezuela, Brazil, China to a lesser extent. Okay? Fire flooding is a thermal method, and I'll tell you a little story. I was in St. Mary's College in 1964, in my final year there, and Shell Trinidad Limited invited the sixth form class to the Shell Savannah Club, which was around the Savannah, to a presentation on the oil industry. And back then, the heart of the presentation that they gave was a demonstration of fire flooding, 1964. To today, that is not yet a mature technology. It is interesting because Dr. Farouk Ali, Professor Farouk Ali, who many of you would have met, when I studied under him in the 1970s, was particularly intrigued by this. And I shared in his intrigue because he said this has the potential for the highest overall recovery of any of the methodologies. But we cannot control the fire. And that is still true. That is still true. So that there have been people who will try to sell you fire flooding techniques. Let them show you where they get it, make it successful first. They're trying it in China. They're trying it in Venezuela. There are 1 or 2 field trials in Canada and the US and so on, small field trials. We're not going anywhere with that. That is costly. That is still in its trial stage. In, you know, how many? 53 years later? Let us leave that. My best advice is let us leave that where we find it. So this is a quick slide of the steam huff and puff or cyclic steam stimulation. Essentially what you do is inject steam into a well, a single well, right? You're not interested in connectivity and so on here. All you're interested in is there enough oil in the reservoir? Thickness and saturation, basically. And you shut the well in for weeks, a few weeks to maybe a few months, right? And then you open back the well. Typically, results are that you will get back rates up to 10 times what your shut-in rates were. That will last you for several months to into years, depending on the quantity of steam that you've injected and, of course, things like the reservoir thickness and so on. Okay? So that is a very successful methodology that has been used, and it has also been used to evaluate fields for continuous flooding, and it has been also used, of course, on its own for small reservoirs and stuff like that. I will jump the gun a little bit and tell you there is a very parallel process for carbon dioxide, but we'll get there when we get there. And steam flooding essentially is injecting steam into one well, off-taking production in an adjacent well, and you form a steam zone around the injection well, hot water zone ahead of it, and that sweeps oil due to the lowered viscosity and some vaporization and so on. And of course, the addition of mass at one end that'll move mass to the other end forward into a production well where you get hot oil, right? These projects, I will show, have produced in Trinidad to 1995, which is the last complete evaluation of all the things that data that I have, over 75 million barrels of oil. Over 75 million barrels of oil from the various projects that we've to 1995, and of course that number will be somewhat higher at this time. For the injection of between 2.5 to about 5 barrels of steam per barrel of oil. So if we have a reasonable way of producing steam, right, at a fairly low cost, then this can be a very economic process. Other variations of steam flooding include SAGD and VAPEX. In both of these, one requires a fairly high degree of vertical continuity, vertical permeability, continuous vertical, because what you want to form is a chamber. So you inject at the bottom, form a chamber, the steam rises, forces oil down into a producer. If you imagine, if you do a thought experiment where you have a large tube of marbles and you pour water at the top, the water will generally pour all the way through very rapidly. If you take a sheet of saran wrap, and you just fold it in four and you put it across the middle the center of that column. So you took out half the marbles, put a sheet of saran wrap, and then you put the marbles on top, right? And you poured the water. You will not be surprised to discover that very little water will come out the bottom. And that is the effect of a thin, very thin, impermeable layer on vertical continuity, right? So if you have thick or interbedded shales, right, regardless of how much vertical sand you have, right, this can pose some difficulties in recovering your oil. Fire flooding, I've talked about fire flooding and its variations, including total heel air injection and foam-assisted tie and stuff like that, right? So I won't, wow, I'm behind the curve, right? So we've talked about those, and I will just stay away from that. I think I don't want to spend my time discussing that. Okay, I've already advised that that is not a way that we ought to be thinking of at this point in time. There may come a time when that becomes something we want to consider. Chemical injection, right? Using various chemicals to lower surface tension, right? Using alkaline or caustic solutions. They have organic acids in them that create soaps. They lower interfacial tension, right? And you may or may not use a polymer solution to chase the chemical solution. I will not go through the slide in detail. You'll get copies of it later on and you can read it. What happens, though, is that for each reservoir configuration that you have, configuration of reservoir fluids and reservoir rock, you need to tailor these solutions exceedingly carefully. And part of the problem is that these solutions get absorbed or interact with the rock. You have a lot more rock than you have rock surface than you have fluid surface. So this process gets expensive pretty quickly. And you consume your chemicals, and especially in cases like ours where we have poor interwell connectivity and stuff like that, you can lose fluids and a lot of this stuff into places that is not going to yield you anything. Right? There's a time for this later on. There are better things we can do with our time and money now. Polymer flooding, we heard about polymer flooding, right? Back in the 1970s, we had a pilot polymer flood in Faizabad. It did not succeed. In fact, it was the subject of the master's thesis of somebody who became CEO of the company that had tried it. And part of the problem, again, is exactly that. Surface activity and the formation, absorption of the chemicals and stuff like that. So again, the polymer and the blends of whatever and the concentrations have to be adapted very specifically to the reservoir. You have to do a significant amount of pre-work in order to tailor this thing right. And then you have to monitor it very, very, very diligently in order to ensure that you are getting the right things to happen. Microbial injection. Microbial injection is we have tried it in Trinidad. In fact, many, many years ago, when I was a not so young reservoir engineer, Professor Moses from Imperial College came down and we spoke about microbial injection. And the case studies that he had indicated were in places like Romania and so on, where production per well was of the order of 3 and 4 barrels a day. And as a result of microbial, he was getting 1 and 2 barrels a day increase. I think the same kinds of results were obtained in our field trials in Trinidad. There may come a time when we need to do that. right, I will probably be long gone. Okay? But I don't think we need to look at this technology at this point in time. A new technology that is emerging is something called plasma pulse. I know very little about it. There is very little actually in the literature, although in Trinidad right now, this is a technology that was developed in the Soviet Union. And people like ConocoPhillips, CNOC, and a couple other people have been trying it. There are people in Trinidad walking around who want to peddle the technology, right? And it's worth looking at, I would say, right? But I wouldn't bet too much on it at this point in time. It may turn out to be much better than I think, but it seems to me to be a near wellbore phenomenon. From what I've read about it, it's a near wellbore phenomenon. So it is not something that, you know, is going to affect us on a very large scale in a significant reservoir system. I will talk about carbon dioxide later on. So it is this is just to whet your appetite, the carbon dioxide steam simulation, where it is very analogous to carbon dioxide stimulation, huff and puff, which is very analogous to the steam huff and puff process that I showed you earlier. You inject carbon dioxide into a single well, you soak it for a couple of weeks, and then you produce mixture of carbon dioxide and oil, with results fairly similar to those that you have from steam. We have tried this successfully in Forest Reserve with very good results over the years. We had to stop that because of lack of a supply of CO2. There are a couple of modes of carbon dioxide injection, huff and puff, miscible and immiscible displacements, right? Both miscible and immiscible floods can be conducted with or without the injection of water to aid CO2 mobility control and increase the efficiency of CO2 utilization. At this point in time, I will again preempt what I'm going to say later on and tell you that efficiency of CO2 utilization is not a major concern to us at this point in time. It will become so later on. Okay? But if we have large supplies that we are blowing to atmosphere, right, we need to get on with the business of injecting that thing into the ground, right? You know, the efficiency of a motor car engine is about 28% now. Well, it started at 18% in the early 1900s. And after more than 100 years of improvements and billions of dollars in improvements, we only improved the efficiency of that engine by about 10%. Right? So efficiency is not the driver, it's the effectiveness that we want. And we have to look at that. So I want to stop there now, because I think I'm encroaching on Donnie's time. Thank you, Donnie, for being patient with me. As we said, we'll take questions now or later? Later, okay, thanks. All right. Thank you very much, and talk to you later again.